Okay, today is the 19th of July, 2025, and I'm going to be moving further into psychological types. Namely, I'm going to be moving from page 195, which is entitled Section 3A, the Brahmanic conception of the problem of opposites. And so I've really been talking about the same problem this entire time, which is the problem of the relationship between three and four, the relationship between any pair of opposites. It's conceived by Jung in terms of introversion and extraversion. Um, it's conceived by John Vervaeke as the process of Dialogos. Um, in John, it's this dialogical, particularly there's like intrapsychic and interpersonal um, forms of dialogue, where by um, holding the creative tension or tonos between different pairs of opposites, one is able to disidentify with the qualities represented by those polarities, and therefore become more transparent. And that transparency allows for um, the analogy is like in Aristotle, for example, holding the bowstring. Well, it's the creative tension of the bowstring holding the pairs of the arms of the bow that allows the arrow to be fired on the third dimension. So it's something about this holding open of the creative tension of pairs of opposites allows for something to flow into the world, and it's something from the source of life. So the way that Jung talks about this is in terms of um, what he first calls the transcendent function, which then becomes the process of individuation. So it's a it's both a goal and the way to that goal onward between the pairs of opposites. Mm. We've been talking about the same thing the whole time. I'm thinking in particular of my review, and which I think is the third video in this series, in which I talk about the functionality of shamanism and the symbol forming power of the logos in connection with this. And so I'm also thinking in particular of pages 14 and 15, really 13, 14, and 15 in psychological types, which is in the review of chapter 2, which is in the big 3 hour long episode in this series. And so yeah, how do I talk about this? The idea is that this interaction between conscious and unconscious can produce a new symbol which expresses the source of life. The emergence of that new symbol is also a renewal of God. And it's an ongoing emergent process in the world that has we have the choice of whether to participate in that process or not. And it will have the quality of transforming the relationship between self and world. By changing the way that we relate with nature. In the last video of the series, we were talking about this historically again, in terms of the relations with the soul. Jung was using the story of Prometheus and Epimetheus in Faust. Sorry, he's talking about Faust separately. He was also talking about Pandora. He was talking about the different presentations of the story of Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Pandora in the work of Carl Spittler and in the work of Goethe. And what was important there for Jung was this balancing of the the introverted and extroverted types, where the introvert for Jung, the focus of their energy is toward the subject, whereas for the extrovert, the focus of their energy is toward the object. And an excess of introversion is sort of epitomized for me by Kierkegaard in some way. It's a lot of being with oneself. And Jung spoke about how in one's inner world, the quality of relationship with one's soul can lead to either suffering or creativity, and that became very important. So in Carl Spitteler's version of the story of Prometheus, the figure of Prometheus, the character of Prometheus, is subservient in relation to his soul, who is Minerva, the goddess. And this means that they don't have the equality in relationship necessary for co-creation together. In contrast, Goethe's version of Prometheus does have this and is able to create in the world by providing the forms that are vivified by the creative contribution of his soul. So in Goethe, there's a co-creative process that arises from the relationship between Prometheus and Prometheus's soul. And it's because Prometheus is able to inhabit his own divinity and therefore relate to his soul on equal terms. The other scenario, again, was back in Carl Spitteler, where the devaluing of oneself by Spitteler's version of the character of Prometheus meant that it led to a maladaptive form of introversion, which led to a deep series of unconscious visions and dreams, creative internal imagery, where that passed into the episode of Pandora in that story, in which the creative work that the soul participated in took place within Prometheus's unconscious. In doing so, it was able to create the new symbol that I've been talking about. And the trouble is that because of this profound disconnect between the maladaptive introversion of that version of Prometheus and his brother, the highly extroverted Epimetheus, because of that disconnect, when that creative symbol was in fact produced into the world, as symbolized by the birth of the Buddha and the revelation of Pandora's jewel before God in that story, that jewel, that manifestation of the new source of life, which is symbolized by the jewel or by the Buddha, was not able to be fully appreciated, and its significance was therefore lost. And so this story points to the profound importance of right relationship between introversion and extroversion, where this unconscious creative process, if successful and manifest in the world, is required to be fully and deeply appreciated by one's more extroverted and, in a sense, rational side for it to be effective. Jung spoke a great deal about the significance of the uniting symbol. And I wanted to speak about that briefly. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more here about why this focus on symbols. And I want to tie in a little sacred geometry to talk about that. So I mentioned in other places the relationship between 3 and 4 is key to this process. And again, we're talking about this holding the creative attention between pairs of opposites. So importantly, I want to invoke this quote by Maria Prophetessa from Jung's book Dreams, or at least quoted in Jung's book Dreams, about page 245. And it goes from 1, 2, from 2, 3, from the third comes the 1 as the fourth. And what this is talking about is a shamanic process. It's a process of rebirth or becoming. So there's a way that imagine an initial state or condition. This is kind of symbolized by the number 1 or by an initial unity or wholeness. There's then a splitting into 2, any of the pairs of opposites that one can imagine. Some quick examples: black and white, masculine and feminine, yin and yang, subject and object, self and world, finite and transcendent, being and non-being, life and death, conscious and unconscious. One and many, differentiated, integrated, and so on. This is the state of polarity. It's the state of duality. Human and God, soul and God, human and soul. These are all pairs, dyads. And so this is represented by this quote from 1, 2, right? It's a move into duality. And there's a claim that from this quote, from 2, 3. So this is connected with this mediating creative process of which we've been speaking, that there is some kind of, that those 2 can be in, that can hold the tension between them in some way, such that there's something between them. And we could talk about that as the relation between the 2. So it's like, for there to be a dyad of any kind, there has to be something which mediates that dyadic form, namely the relationship between. And again, that's ultimately going to be metaphorical, because we can see that the polarities can be defined as relata, the things in relationship. And we can see that relations and relata are another duality. But if relation is one of the poles, then it can't be the betweenness. So I'm going to leave that behind, so just to say that, yeah, I don't want to get stuck in a relational ontology. We can see here that we've moved from this talking about there being 2 to an awareness of there being some kind of third. Whether that be a process that the 2 are engaged in, something that emerges between them, the ground upon which they're both standing, something like that. And I want to name there that, there are religious structures built on all these different stages. All the different monotheisms or monisms are built on the awareness of there being one unity, one wholeness. All the forms of duality, devotion to God, for example, are based on dualistic systems, dualistic religious systems. I'm not evaluating them. I'm stating that this is the case, like in terms of religious history. If we look at the 3, we can see that there is an awareness that between the two, or by virtue of relationship between the two, there is a third something, and whether it be an emergent property, a process to participate in, um, in Christianity, you could say the Holy Spirit. And there's an awareness that this third is important in addition to the one and the two. This can lead to a problem that I want to name, which is that there can be an attentional focus on that third. And importantly, I mentioned that it was only in certain forms of relationship between the two that that third is produced. And that means that if there is an over-focus on the emergent property, on the third of which I speak, that it can vanish. It can not be there. And so this is the reason for this focus on the mediation of opposites, is that there is a processing of any of the pairs of opposites which is required for this emergent property on, let's say, the third dimension to emerge or arise. And that's still necessary. Like, if we're overwhelmed by that, if we get excited about that and stop doing this dynamic, reciprocal, back and forth, holding the tension between the pairs of opposites, then we will essentially become distracted by the creative products of the process in which we're engaged. So importantly, there's a further step beyond that. I'm going to give an example of this process to help. I think the example that I want to use is the creative power of shamanic speech in dialogue in particular. So there's a way that imagine that dialogue is entered into. And with another, it can be any other. So imagine that there's, the best way is to describe this process here, right? So it's like there's someone that I'm speaking to. That makes this a dialogue by definition, even if I don't know with whom I'm in dialogue. And the speaking, or the let's say the manifestation of the logos, the creative word, the word that can reveal the truth. So importantly, that's not like everything that I say, right? There's like sometimes my speech is better able to adhere to the form of the logos, let's say, than at other times. And I think we can feel that when it's genuinely of the logos. I'm not going to talk about what it is here. Importantly, one can consider that logos, that shamanic speech, to be a product of the will in some way. So there's a focusing on the other, first of all, and there's a way that the logos can be very animated. It can kind of will itself into being in this way. But when I focus on the relationship between 3 and 4, I'm talking about the directing or focusing of that logos upon everything that is represented by the 4. So what do I mean by that? Well, here by the number 3, I mean the masculine. I mean the triangle, the pyramid, self-determination, ego identity. I am. I mean the solar plexus chakra. I mean power, strength. And by 4, I mean the square rather than the triangle. I mean Mother Earth. I mean the inanimate. I mean the material. And I mean the unconscious creative matrix as well. So when I say that it has to do with the relationship between 3 and 4, again, we can refer to the quote which says, from 1, 2, from 2, 3, from the third comes the one as the fourth. So I'm here talking about a way of, for example, if we put the quote unquote unconscious material world in the position of 4, and if we put the um, divine power of the animated logos in the position of 3, just for the sake of an example, then in theory there would be a way of directing that 3, that which is represented by 3 in that example, toward that which is directed at toward that which is in the position of 4, the fourth in that example. Such that, yeah, from the third comes the one as the fourth. It's very clear to me what that means, and it's very hard to talk about what exactly I mean by that. What does it have to do with symbols? I'm talking about a specific creative process, and it's like after any pair of opposites can be held in creative tension, there is a deeper level, because those two opposites held in tension are only at the level of two-ness or duality. And beneath them, closer to the core of life, I want to say, closer to the essence of life. Beneath them, there is a relationship between 3 and 4. And we're going to try and talk about that so that we can achieve more clarity about what exactly it is. Again, I want to name this important quality of differentiation from the different pairs of opposites. We see the importance of this page 109, 10, and 11 in psychological types. This disidentification from pairs of opposites is by this differentiation, I'm talking about this capacity to recognize that one is necessarily both sides of any particular relationship. So when one is relating with the other, one is also that other. If one is only able to identify as the masculine, this is one doesn't have access to one's femininity, and vice versa. And so this is a quality of where the individual is not able to differentiate from the opposites. So there's a way of transcending and including those opposites within one's being. The alternative is to over-identify with them and essentially be torn apart by them. And the question is then how to achieve this differentiated quality. So uh, in the process of, for example, if this duality is represented by the process of dialectic into dialogos, in which there is a dialogue between, for example, an intrapsychic dialogue between finitude and transcendence, or an interpersonal dialogue between any two pairs of opposites that are discussed. How are those opposites able to be united at a deeper level? Well, Jung from page 110 and 111 talks about the will as the will has a certain power of preserving complete freedom between both pairs of opposites to hold them in creative tension. But it needs a certain direction. There's always a will to or a will for something. And that means that we're looking for where should the will be directed? Here, the will is in the position of 3, as I said. So Jung was talking about this power that can, or capacity, this function that can hold the opposites together and apart. And he talks about the will in this context. The will is in the 3rd position. But that will needs a direction, so that it needs a 4th to aim toward. And on page 111, we can see that that will is already determined from both sides. So both of the polarities of any duality. So let's say the conscious and unconscious. So the conscious and the unconscious both contribute to the will. However, Jung talks about this direction. It needs to be grounded on a certain intermediate state or process. And the reason for that is so that it's not overdetermined by one side or the other. And so Schiller and Jung from page 111 are in agreement that it's only the symbol that can reach this mediating position. And again, this is for Jung, again, we're talking about the unification of rational and irrational, of the thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. So we're talking about a process of symbol formation. And so I'm not going to go into right now the qualities of symbols that allow them to access this mediating position. I'm simply stating that is the case. So as I said, like a symbol is a vector pathway to the divine. So it's, yeah, this mediating position between the pairs of opposites can be reached only by the symbol, giving it the power to settle conflicts of different kinds. So that means that we're talking about a mediating process which is symbolic in nature, but that also has a specific direction. We're inquiring what is that direction to be? So the will needs a certain basis, actually. As Jung quotes on page 112, to discover, therefore, that impartial basis for the will, we must appeal to another authority where the opposites are not yet clearly separated. but still preserve their original unity. So here we can see that this capacity, this function of being able to divide or differentiate into pairs of opposites is coming from or coming out of a certain uh, deeper level. And it's that deeper level that Jung is inquiring about. Where, as he says, the opposites are not yet clearly separated. He thinks that this capacity to divide, differentiate, and separate goes along with consciousness. He says that the separation into pairs of opposites is entirely due to conscious differentiation. So he doesn't think that our consciousness can decide the conflict. So he thinks that symbols have this power to reach this mediating position that we speak of. So the question then becomes, where do symbols come from? And so the conscious side cannot supply the will with the necessary symbolic content that it needs. Because we have this, at a conscious level, a logical antithesis between pairs of opposites. And symbols can mediate that conflict in some way, but they don't arise from the will. They don't arise from the conscious side. They arise actually from a combination of conscious and unconscious processes. Again, we can see that when we talk about dualities, conscious and unconscious can be a version of that, a form of that dualism. And again, we're talking about a process which is between. Yeah, and so that gets us to page 113. This is still review, where we're getting to clarify that there is a kind of yeah, there's an independent kind of middle position that occupies a kind of borderline between conscious and unconscious. And symbols inhabit that middle space, that mediating space. And so there's a way that our this this position from which, yeah, this mediating position between the pairs of opposites, which are in creative tension, that that has that which is in that position, namely the will, sorry, it's a mediating position between the opposites. And the conscious and the unconscious sides of the personality both contribute to that. The conscious side contributes the conscious will, and the unconscious side contributes the unconscious will. I would say that the will is mostly contributed by the conscious half of the personality, in which case we'll talk about two different situations in which, on the one hand, the conscious side contributes mostly the will, and therefore the unconscious side contributes the symbols that we speak of. And in the reverse situation, the conscious side would be producing the symbols, and the unconscious side would be producing the will. So there's a deeper force or power which is determining the will. So the will is directed at something. It's also directed by something. And this is the position of the relationship between 3 and 4, which is a mediating position between the opposites. On page 114, we can see actually, I won't talk about page 114. I will talk about page 115, because we can see here that there is a new kind of symbol. So there's contributions to this new symbol in the form of it's actually a new life center and a new version of God. And I'm just going to state. And there are symbols. Yeah, symbols are a part of that process that are contributed both by the conscious side of the personality and the unconscious side of the personality. And yeah, in the more introverted condition, such as in the creative fantasy of Prometheus that we discussed last time, in that more introverted condition, the unconscious supplies more of the will. I think that would be right to say. And the conscious supplies more of the symbols, which are then so in that kind of introverted creative visionary state, the unconscious is in a masculine role. And the conscious side of the personality is in the feminine role, the role of receiving the unconscious will into symbolic form. However, in the more extroverted condition or state, in a more extroverted form of this process, the conscious side of the personality contributes more of the will, the energy. And the unconscious side contributes more of the symbols. Meaning that the symbolic forms are provided already by the natural world. And the will, and actually the willing logos, is provided by conscious man. And so this process can be engaged in intrapsychically and in inter yeah intrapersonally and interpersonally, meaning in communion with the inner world and in communion with the outer world. And as I've just discussed, different roles are taken on in either situation, more introversion or extroversion. But in either case, the intrapsychic process corresponds to shamanic rebirth. Excuse me. The interpersonal process corresponds with shamanic practice. And as a result of this process, it doesn't have, that's the thing, is that it's completion isn't exactly reached. We're not trying to get to a certain goal. It's an ongoing process. So something is uncovered in this process. And what is uncovered is the source of life itself. That means that it's a source of revivifying creative energy. It results in a new form of symbolic language, I think. And yeah, I want to say that it's a communal process. It's a process of communion and involves the co-transformation of pairs of opposites, of self and world in particular. It's also, Jung talks about this as the emergence of the self. What does he mean by that? It's a new center of consciousness. It's equivalent to the move from the geocentric model of the solar system to the heliocentric model of the solar system, only intrapsychically. The idea would be that a new center of consciousness of some kind is required to mediate the conflict between the existing pairs of opposites. So there's a understanding or realization that there is irreconcilable conflict, that there is a separateness which cannot be overcome, and that is leading to destruction. And one can then understand that the will, so as Jung says on page 114, the will then has the self as a possible aim, and it becomes the more possible, the more any further development is arrested by the conflict. So when the progress of life is blocked by this irreconcilable conflict between separate forms, then directing the will towards the emerging center of consciousness, which Jung calls the self, is the way forward, according to Jung. And that means that this emerging center of personality, which takes symbolic form, takes the form of a new symbol or process of symbol creation. It's both. That center is a source of energy. It's also an energy sink. So it's a kind of strange attractor. Jung says that the disposable energy is withdrawn into the self. In other words, introverted. It's introverted by that self. So this emerging center of personality that can mediate the conflict between the opposites by the willing participation of both conscious and unconscious sides of the personality and of symbols, forms contributed by either side. It what about it? It becomes a transjective center of consciousness. So it's not exactly, it's, yeah, as I said, a new center of awareness, new center of conscious awareness, but that doesn't make it a subject. It's a combination of subject and object that I call transjective. It's from Viveki. And so it's both something that energy can be given to and something that gives energy. I'm not sure how much. So it's an entity distinct from the ego. It involves, yes, I would say that one's relationship with it can be deepened when one takes up the point of view of the soul. So the further one can inhabit the perspective of one's own soul, the deeper one can engage with this emerging center of consciousness. And this allows us to see that this new center of personality is also an expression. It also facilitates the expression of uniqueness. I'm looking at the footnote on page 114, which says, insofar as individuality embraces our innermost lasts and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. The self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. The self is our life's goal. Yes, and so the more one is able to inhabit one's own uniqueness, the more one is able to move into deep relation, deep dialogue with this new emerging center, which establishes a kind of feedback loop between this new emerging center and creative energy. So the energy for expression of one's uniqueness, or the expression of creative artistic forms, and for the expression of individuality itself. So it allows one to move deeper into being one's own person, being oneself. And the reason that that's important is because when I talk about an emerging center of personality, it may feel as if one's personhood is stripped from one. And it may well be true that the ego, what is egoic about us, may not survive this process, which is akin to it's a transformative process, renewal or rebirth of God, that is equivalent to the snake shedding its skin. Imagine that the skin that we've been wearing is the ego. Well, it may need to be shed. However, our personhood is deeply connected with our quality of soul, soulfulness, uniqueness, individuality. And these are not only preserved, but enhanced, confirmed, deepened, and facilitated in their expression. Just to mention here as well, the significance of the state of introversion is a detachment from objects. So the energy, um, or also the creative energy or the wills connected with libido also, um, is detached from inner and outer objects. So it's a state in which the consciously available energy is taken away from all objects, all thoughts, feelings, sensations, intuitions, or real objects in the world. And it therefore sinks into the unconscious, and it automatically takes possession of the waiting fantasy material, which it thereupon activates and forces to the surface. So this is a condition of introversion. This results in as we saw in Prometheus, this results in the birth of a new center of consciousness. That takes form I think it takes form in a symbol, but it also takes form in the use of symbols. So it takes form, can be accessed via a process of symbolic language. And this allows that new center of consciousness to be extroverted. It allows it to be applied in relation to objects. That makes it's a source of life. This new emerging center of consciousness, it's a source of life itself. It's something to participate in, not something that can be explained. Although I'm doing my best. It's still unconscious, but it's coming closer to the surface of consciousness. And unconsciously, it is expressed in symbolic form. I think consciously, it will come to be expressed as an applied form of shamanic dialogue. But unconsciously, it's expressed in symbolic form. So it's life, energy, or libido that's expressed in forms that are known to and known by the conscious side that Jung calls symbols of the self. And so the unconscious expression of this ongoing emergence of a new center of consciousness is captured for Jung, it's captured in the symbols of the process of individuation. Which he talks about as the symbols which represent the emergence of this new center of personality. And it's those symbols which are studied in psychology and alchemy in particular, which I'm looking at in my series on the book Dreams. The significance of these symbolic forms is that they can have this is from page 115, that they can have a determining effect on the will. And so we have the intuition that they're deeply meaningful, even if we don't understand them rationally. So there's a way that when the unconscious expresses these symbols of the self, it's a satisfying process. It's relieving expression. It's kind of creative achievement. That means that after the expression of such symbols by the unconscious, the opposites, in a way, recover their strength. So there's a way that there has to be a kind of block or a conflict in order for the process to reach its head, to reach a culminating point. And the creative expression of these symbols allows things to move forwards, and therefore this the facilitating aspect of this process determines the will, which when the progression through the conflict of the opposites was blocked, the will was then directed to the self. When the self is then expressed in symbolic form, the will is determined by that self, and the conflict between the opposites is mediated. That means that a new form of opposition must arise for the process to continue. There will be at some point a renewed conflict that will demand the same treatment. And so that's why it's a recurring process. It's a function of the mediation between any pair of opposites. It's termed here the transcendent function. So we've been talking about a dynamic process that is being rediscovered. There are ancient and new aspects of this process. And this process, there's no difference between, like, to ask what it is also to ask what it does. And that makes it a function. So we're asking a structure and function question. So what it is a new emerging center of consciousness. It has the function of mediating pairs of opposites, mediating between pairs of opposites. It also serves as a new source of life. And it plays a key role in the rebirth of God. that is occurring in our time. It has a combination of conscious and unconscious elements and of real and imaginary qualities. It's an impartial basis for the will, a direction for that will to aim. It unites the opposites in itself, and hence it participates in instinctive nature right down to the animal level. And that makes it a medium between the eternal and the temporal, and in it we are most alive. That's from page 109. I will not address the demonic or daemonic quality of this now. So we've ended up defining the transcendent function, the process of individuation, the emergence of the self in the form, in unconscious, the unconscious emergence of it in the form of symbols of the self. That, if they're understood, they're consciously appreciated, can come into conscious emergence. So it's the creative fantasy of the unconscious that leads to this expression of the emergence of the self in the form of symbols of the self, namely mandala symbols that are talked about in dreams. So again, this transcendent function has to do with the relationship between 3 and 4, which are equivalent to masculine and feminine, between the rational and irrational functions, between conscious and unconscious, between will and creative fantasy. And so if we take our will and we direct it out to this source of life, if we direct it to in this direction toward this emerging center, this process as it's ongoing and unfolding, where the will has the self as its possible aim. We understand the importance of that because that creative fantasy, this I think we are the form. We are the form. So it's like this distinction here between essence and form, where if we can allow this energy to this force, this power of consciousness, let's say, of the self to flow through us, it can then revivify forms in the world and around us. However, it can also revivify us. We are a form of life. And so that irrational, instinctive foundation can flow into us. It can also flow through us into the world. That's important because this is making oneself transparent. It's a non-identification with any given qualities because yeah, those qualities that one identifies with, they're going to be swallowed. But it's that irrational instinctive foundation that alone has the power to supply the will with content of such a nature that it can unite the opposites, any opposites. It's from page 115. And that's what, yeah, hmm. So the will is supplied by this power. It's supplied with energy. It's also supplied with material content. It, I think it's both, and this is why this is tricky to articulate. It's like form and essence are contributed from both sides. But it is this new center that I speak of is the source of symbols. So it has a symbolic content. And so those symbols are, they contain energy. They are the most basic or foundational forms into which energy can gather, cohere. So importantly, on this topic of the will is the kind of the attitude or disposition of the conscious half of the personality in this process. The directive of which is to humble oneself, to be in humility, to be in one's humanity. Also, these qualities are connected, by which I mean the etymology of humble humility being humus humil, meaning low and ground, and of human, similarly humanity meaning earthling, people of the earth. And so these four are being connected in this, um, yeah, willing attitude, willing attitude. Um, Another way to say that would be consenting attitude. And it's a consenting to life. It's a will to life. It's not a will to power. Yeah. And so once we have that directive for the will, again, this is in the introverted condition. Has to do with the intra-psychic process. There's then a later extroverted stage, which involves um, taking the position of taking the masculine position, and that is um, allowing this content to flow through one into the world, and to revivify the forms which are already made available, which can already be seen. But in the introverted condition, which comes first, and they definitely cycle, when the will takes up this, the conscious half takes up this feminine role, willing condition. This is from page 116. There's this orientation. Yeah, it's this willing attitude toward the creative matrix. So it's yeah. So the trick here is that we think of will as masculine, and that's that connected with three, and we think of three and triangle, solar plexus, pyramid, etc. We think of that as masculine, and in that case, the creative matrix or great mother, which is beneath that will, is in the feminine role, right? But when we're talking about a willing attitude, consent to life, this is the attitude or directive of the will. This is where the will chooses, humbles, lowers itself to take up the feminine role, much in the spirit of Tao, verse 66, which goes, how does the sea become the king of all streams? Because it lies lower than they, hence it is the king of all streams. Therefore, the sage reigns over the people by humbling himself in speech and leads the people by putting himself behind. Thus it is that when a sage stands above the people, they do not feel the heaviness of his weight, and when he stands in front of the people, they do not feel hurt. Therefore, all the world is glad to push him forward without getting tired of him. Just because he strives with nobody, nobody can ever strive with him. What do I mean by this? I mean, that verse worth studying, but what I mean by it here is that there's this attitude of humbling, lowering oneself into one's humanity. And that is required for the attainment of on what page 116 is called like a freedom from all determinants. So there's this is a kenosis, it's a self-emptying process. So this being in the receptive is like taking up the role of the vessel. And so it's emptying oneself as a vessel. So it's a negative state. It's a state of inner emptiness into which so it's a taking up by the conscious side of an empty condition. So empty rather than full, and passive rather than active, receptive rather than creative. Yes, where the unconscious is taking the position, let's say, of this full active multiplicity compared to the empty passive unity of the conscious side. Yeah, so it's aiming toward a condition of making oneself determinable, um, fluid, flexible, available. since yeah, something positive is to result from that condition. It's a creative condition. So again, it's this uniting of the opposites in a creative process, the different pairs of opposites. And in this, yeah, introverted stage of the process, the conscious side takes on this feminine receptive role, and the unconscious side takes on the masculine role. And the product of that is the creative process, the transcendent function, the source of symbols that results in, yes, as we've said, detachment from objects, inner objects and outer objects. That is necessary, that detachment from, it's like an inner emptiness. And without that inner emptiness, it's not possible to be indeterminate and empty of content. And that emptiness of content is the original state of unconsciousness, the symbol of which is the Ouroboros, the self-fertilizing source of life, snake eating its own tail. That's what we're attempting to make space for, essentially. Again, one of the reasons for this focus on the symbol is because the symbol, as per page 117 and 18, has this quality of being related to all psychic functions without being a specific object for any single one of them. So the symbols have this binding quality. They can participate in something that's beyond what we can understand, but we can also participate in them. They don't belong to anyone. They're shared by all. And that allows us to see that the symbol forming activity, creative fantasy that results from this process allows any pair of opposites to be mediated, unified in something deeper than them. And that mediating disposition makes it possible for man, by the way of nature, to make of himself what he will. The freedom to be what he ought to be is completely restored to him. It's a quote from Schiller. So again, hmm, the unconscious, the unconscious produces symbols of this emerging center of personality. And those are symbols of what Jung calls the self. And those are found cross-culturally. And Jung is going to discuss those. Importantly, it seems that when the unconscious is producing such symbols in the state in which the unconscious is producing such symbols, Jung defines that as a state of introversion. Because it's the unconscious which is producing this. And the conscious side is receiving this. So the conscious side is empty and being filled by the symbolic contents that come from nature, that come from the natural source of life in the unconscious. And importantly, we talked about this after the emergence of these symbols. There is a flipping over to a different state, an extroverted state. And in a more, I seem, just before I mention that, just to say that it seems that historically speaking, this could mean that the entirety of our history, the entirety of human history, is an introverted condition. It's just a thought which I will leave there to say that at some point this process flips over the symbol of the self. Sorry, the symbols of this emerging center of consciousness that are produced by the creative activity of the unconscious. There can be a kind of role reversal into an extroverted condition in which the conscious side of the personality, instead of being in the feminine receptive condition of emptying oneself and being a passive recipient, being indetermined by the pairs of opposites. Instead, in the extroverted state, the material, the symbolic material, symbolic contents are provided by the conscious side of the personality. And again, these symbols, when they're provided by the unconscious side or when they're provided by the conscious side, they are a combination of form and energy, form and essence, form and libido. And similarly, they're living symbols, right? There's this combination of form and essence. Similarly, when they're provided by the conscious half of the personality, they are this shamanic combination of life force flowing through one and creative form. Yes, in the introverted condition, the creative products, namely symbols of the self, natural symbols, are produced from out of the relationship with one's soul and what Jung calls the unconscious, or we could call the source of life or God. It's out of their relationship that these symbols are produced and then received by their receptive consciousness. But in the creative or extroverted condition, what the relationship between the conscious self and the soul. So again, it's not. So here, like me as Sam, this is the role of the ego, right? And I have a relationship with my soul that can yield creative products. And this is important. However, I'm talking here about the extroverted condition, which is and the creative products of this extroverted condition, which are the result of a relationship between oneself as one soul and the self. This seems to be it's more of the relationship between the soul and God and expressing from out of that relationship. Again, tricky to talk about. In any case, this development of the process, the relationship between conscious and unconscious, from the introverted condition of determinacy by the unconscious, being determined by the unconscious, to the extroverted condition of being more determined by the conscious or willing half. It seems that in the first instance, it's more of an intrapsychic process, and the conscious, willing half of the personality humbles oneself, lowers oneself before the creative fantasies of the unconscious, which for its part provides the symbols, full of energy, full of life, provides the contents for the will. After this changeover, after so that process of introversion that I just described has a result, has a creative product, which is the symbols of the self are just that, they're symbols, right? They're symbols of the emerging center of consciousness. And when that, so quote unquote, actually happens, then one can still take up the perspective of one's soul in relation to that self. And so this implies that extroverted stage after the emergence of the self is the same as the previous stage, because in that previous stage, the will was in the feminine receptive role, humbling oneself, and the unconscious was in the role of being the active masculine principle, providing creative products. Now, in this more extroverted condition after the emergence of the self, it is still possible to take up the perspective of the soul. However, that soul is then taking up the creative position. And that, yes, the soul is in a way in a masculine role, in a sense, a creative role. And it's the yes. So there's a potential source of confusion there because it's then still the relationship between, like, from the point of view, from the perspective of one soul, if one can take up that perspective and relating to the new emerging center of consciousness, the self, from that role, um, that self appears to be in the opposite role in that at that point. It would be in the role of the feminine. So providing all of the forms into which the creative soul speaks, creates. Yes, that the creative soul would then fill the empty, unconscious forms with consciousness, so to say, bringing the world to life, bringing the world to life. And this would be that more extroverted condition of being out in the world is kind of equivalent to this dynamic relationship between the soul of nature and the soul of mankind. I think that last point may be more confusing at this stage than clarifying. So what I want to say at this point is that when the self, namely the emerging center of consciousness, emerges into the conscious half of the personality, when that happens, one is given the strength to take up the perspective of one's own soul and to relate to the world from that perspective. And so when that emerging center of consciousness, when it emerges from the unconscious, when it's realized in conscious form, in a conscious condition, one realizes oneself as the soul of mankind. So it's in assuming the identity as the soul. And in Jung's dialogues with his own soul, she revealed to him that when heaven and earth are out of alignment, the soul splits into three different parts: the heavenly, earthly, and human aspects of the soul. And I understand this as meaning that when the when the emerging center of personality, namely the self, moves from its unconscious symbolic expression to its conscious realization as in humanity, as the soul of mankind, when we take up the identity of the soul of humanity, we can then, from that perspective, relate with the soul of nature, relate with nature in her natural state, in her condition. And so what I'm saying there is that when the identity of the soul of mankind can be taken up, when that perspective can be taken up, one then has the honor of being able to revivify, reintegrate, and reconnect all different forms. And some of those forms are earthly, and some of those forms are more heavenly. And so from the point of view of the soul of mankind, from that perspective, one can creatively engage with it's a co-transforming of self and world. It's a participatory dynamic between the soul and the self. And I think what I mean by that is that the self is a center of consciousness, which is a perfectly reflective glass. It's a void. And one's soul is, by contrast, colorful, full, active, and multiple. Yes. And out of their relationship, this is between the soul, this is in the extroverted condition, after the conscious realization of oneself as the soul of mankind, one can then, by self-reflection, by reflection upon the self, and therefore from out of the relationship between soul and self, one has the kind of shamanic creative capacity to reunify the sort of revivify the forms, to infuse, to spread that light of conscious awareness, to infuse all the forms, namely to confer upon nature the consciousness of her soul, and to bring the spiritual or heavenly aspect of the soul down to earth. And this reunifying process of those three aspects of the soul, heavenly, human, and earthly, by reflection at the self. That process, so the conscious realization of one not only as a conscious humankind, not only as the soul of mankind, but also these other aspects of the soul of nature, and heavenly aspect of the soul. This process is also equivalent to the individuation of the soul of the world. And by the world, I mean the whole works. And so the the symbols of the self that Jung speaks of, they, namely the mandala and etc., they represent this process before its time. So from the introverted point of view, the introverted condition, they come to us naturally before we've been ready to realize them consciously. And for this reason, Jung can refer to particularly these Eastern symbols that naturally arise in dreams and religions worldwide, historically and cross-culturally, and in the modern day. As he refers to them as, you know, with the significance of the uniting symbol. And so he wants to talk in particular, as I will do in the next video, about the Brahman Atman teachings in India and the Tao of Lao Tzu. It's this creative principle, this dynamic source of life that will arise in conscious form as the source of self-realization. And so by talking about the Eastern symbols, we can appreciate more of their significance for the conscious realization of this process. The differences between the Eastern and Western dimensions of this process. I think we can see that we can see even from here that these Eastern conceptions, being in a way as described by Jung as more introverted, they represent I would say in a way, higher forms of spiritual development of mankind before the self-realization of mankind. And I think following the conscious emergence of this new center of personality, following the conscious emergence of the self, we can see that the extroverted forms of the West which are in some sense, as Jung says, like the diametrical opposite of the Indian religious attitude, can realize the same, realize a different stage, a different aspect of the same process of spiritual development. Yeah, where Tao is the right way, the reign of law, the middle road between the opposites, freed from them and yet uniting them in itself. That's what we have been talking about. And that's what we will be talking about more.